one of the inspirations for me giving you this song. Because of the squirrels and the birds crawling all over the people of London, who apparently are way kinder to, are way more in touch with the non-human animals than we are. They love them, therefore they can deal with werewolves, and they want to imitate their hairstyles and walk along with them. And because of our whole animals and humans thing, which we were doing in the last class, I meant to play this for the last class, but it's better now. And because of our whole discussion of how wolves are the ones that hunt down the deer, and that you can't have wolves in the suburbs or even downtown Oneonta, that would be weird, and do their things, but you probably can't have wolves. And finally, we're going to be talking a little bit about some Ojibwa ideas about animals and people and transformation. But a werewolf, of course, is a transformation between human to wolf and back again, I think, in most cases, which is one of the things that some of the more powerful shamans of the North, that's how you know that they can do. They can walk as animals and transform from people to animals and back again, especially in dreams. Anyway, see, it all makes sense. So that's our introduction. We start this chapter with Francis Bacon from 1620, a mere 400 years ago. Why? What does Francis Bacon tell us? Year 1620. The English philosopher, statesman, Francis Bacon, along with his exact contemporary Ingold, tells us Galileo. What are these guys known for? Yeah, the scientific revolution. I'm not up on my scientific revolution so much, but there they are, the scientific revolution. The person who wanted to know basing the facts, the person who wants to know just the facts and the real world data. So Ingold begins with this separation between the facts and the data and the scientific revolution, the outline of it by Bacon to give us these things. And that is on page 61. Bacon's words have an unmistakable contemporary ring. So science, we love science here. Today's science continues to found its legitimacy upon its recourse to the data, which were repeatedly checked and rechecked in a never-ending search for truth through the elimination of error. Now, anthropologists usually aren't some of us are super scientific, but for the most part, we also study people's construction of the world, their imagination. And so anthropologists are often more sympathetic to what we might call indigenous ways of life or different ways of imagining the world. But in the end, we're supposed to believe, and I'm supposed to tell you, that science is real. You want to get those facts and the data and get rid of the stupid stuff. And if you're doing imagining and off in fantasy land, don't do it. Because here we do science and it's real, and it's just the facts. None of this werewolves of London stuff. And in fact, to connect to our last chapter, if you remember, that was part of the debate between Robert Payne and Tim Ingold. Payne accused me of presenting an anthropomorphic fantasy. Ingold, you're acting like those reindeer are humans. You're acting like the reindeer think, learn, and do all these things. And then Payne fumed. He's angry. Where is the evidence for this? You know, he's saying, look, Ingold, you're not doing good science. You don't have the facts. So stop this imaginary anthropomorphic fantasy shit and give me the real deal. Give me the evidence. What is the evidence for your conclusions that these reindeer can go around and learn things and pass on their knowledge and strategize like humans do? So we have learned that science is real. And don't get me wrong, science is great. However, the consequences of having to learn that science is real and such a taking away our fantasies, always demanding evidence, well, what happens to us? My contention in this chapter is that Bacon's injunction, the whole scientific revolution thing, which modern science has taken to its heart, has had fateful consequences for human life and habitation. With our hopes and dreams suffused in the ether of illusion, we're just dreaming out there, life itself appears diminished, shorn of its creative impulse. It no longer gives cause for wonder or astonishment. Now, on the one hand, Ingold is playing out how this came out historically, slowly and painfully over the past 400 years or so, as we drained out the world of astonishment and creativity and replaced it with the science and the facts and the data. But Tiana, it also plays out in our own lives as we grow up. I sound like a senior who's been crushed by the educational system, going off into the world. Yes, on page 62, Ingold tells us that the historical process is recapitulated today in the education of every school child. That's you. That's recapitulated in every school child who is taught on pain of failure. Oh my gosh, I'm going to give you an F. You're taught on pain of failure in their examinations to distrust the sensuous, to prize intellect over intuition, and to regard the imagination as an escape from real life rather than its impulse. It's sounding sadder and sadder. This is what I've done to you. You right now, you're sad. You're just sitting there. You have nowhere else to go. The only people who can escape are the people who are feverishly dreaming because they have fevers. In the intro class, I tried to tell them to go out and hunt and fish and gather and jump out of their chairs, and nobody moved. They wouldn't move. They just kept copying things down from the PowerPoint. Fair. And actually, Ingold is in the end arguing that bringing imagination back in, to preview point, bringing this into our lives will help us do better science if we just admitted that we need to be better observers of them. So there's one interpretation of Ingold, which I have had over the years, is that he's anti-science because this is pretty critical, that he's reduced you to automatons for a grade, and it's mean and sad. But eventually he's trying to get us to the point where we do better science because we admit that we are human beings in a world. It's great to be astonished by things. Those wonderful social media sites that are science is fucking awesome and show you some cool things. It's good. Wonder and astonishment. But you also have to admit that a lot of people get their intuition and their creativity beaten out of them in the educational process, and they end up sad. True. So we have learned that dragons aren't real. I rarely chase Ingold endnotes, but in fact, his sentence on page 63, "There's no such thing as a dragon," comes from this children's book by Jack Kent. Apparently, it's actually an allegory for this kid goes in and his mom tells him that he talks about his dragon, and she's like, dragons aren't real. And then the dragon grows big and takes their house away. And the dad comes home from work and doesn't have a house, has to go down. And then they acknowledge that the dragon is real. And then the dragon shrinks back down. And then they pet the dragon. And the mom's like, dragons are better if they're little, and then you can tell them who they are. And so the moral of the story is, if you deny your problems, they grow big. But if you name them, they're small. So this is supposed to be good for adults too. But there's no such thing as a dragon, says Ingold and says science. So then what do we make of Saint Benedict? I was trying to find a picture of the monk who sees a dragon. I could only come up with this from Saint Benedict, of some devil sitting on stones while the monks pray the devil out. It's pretty cool. Phil, what do you think about medieval people and the dragons? Sometimes we think, they thought they were real, and perhaps there were people who thought there were real dragons. There are some real fearsome creatures out there that could be like dragons. But in this case, or at least this monk's case, what happens? He saw a dragon. He did see a dragon. That's the whole point. Because what was that dragon that he saw? The dragon is the incarnation of what it meant to know fear. So here he goes outside. He gets cast out of the monastery because he's a jerk. And he goes out there and he sees a dragon because it's like, that is fear incarnate. Now, what would you do if I threw you out of the classroom and you saw a dragon and you were in fear? And what would your classmates do at that point? What did the other monks do what about the other monks? What did they do when the monks saw the dragon? Did they see the dragon? No. They didn't see the dragon. So what did they do? He got exiled and then he saw the dragon and they bring him back in. And then he never goes out again because he doesn't want to meet the dragon. Now, if you saw a dragon, let's say you walked out there trying to go to the bathroom when you weren't supposed to, and there was a dragon there, and the rest of you went out to find out why he was paralyzed of fear in the hall, and he was paralyzed in front of what he said was a dragon. Huh? I would probably give you psychiatric referral eventually, but for the moment, I would say, get back in here. Just walk through it, man. Walk it off. But in this case, they didn't say that. In fact, the other monks help out the person and they understood exactly what was going on. Even though they didn't see the dragon, they knew that that monk had seen the dragon, and that dragon was the manifestation of fear. And so they helped out the monk, not by saying, it's not real, don't worry about it, or you should go to the psychiatrist and take the right kind of medications because you've been taking the wrong stuff back there in the monastery. They said, no, this is real and it's a representative of what you need to like overcome in your life. And in so doing, they understood the realness of this for the person who was experiencing it, and they felt compassion toward the monk and brought the monk back in. That's kind of a crazy story. Very different than the way we would think of things today. Another example, we have talked about dreams and the idea, of course, that if somebody wakes up in a fright or dreams about a ghost or a dragon or something, my kid does this, I'm like, hey, it's only a dream. Don't worry about it. Now, we do have a dream, but in science, if you have a dream, then you're supposed to go into the lab and prove it. You go in, okay, I had this dream, and you can have inspiration from a dream, but you can't call on the dream for evidence of benzene. You have to prove it in the lab, and then you can say, I found out about it in my dream. Now, for the Ojibwa, or in certain other peoples, this works in the other direction. What happens to that kid who sees a thunderbird, a special elder who had a dream and says, hey, this kid saw the thunderbird. So for the Ojibwa, the dreams are the proof of reality. You see it in a dream, that's where it manifests first. The spiritual is bigger than the physical. And in some ways, that is the proof. The scientist had a dream, but then he goes into the lab and proves it, versus the idea that in some ways the dream is the opening up of the self into the reality. Maybe that's the proof itself, like the elder who proves the thunderbird was there. It's something to think about. It's a different way of approaching life. Let me read a couple passages here. Science concedes the imagination the power of conjecture, to think outside the box, but only by banishing imagination from the very reality to which it affords insight. So in the scientist's case, it gives you this moment of inspiration. You're thinking outside the box, but you really have to prove it by the reality. For the Ojibwa, by contrast, it would have been quite the other way around. For them, the truth of things is not only found, but also tested by personal experience, oniric experience. I think that's dreaming, which is why the boy's sighting of the thunderbird, Pinese, could be corroborated by his elder's dream. So in this sense, It's the dreams, another passage there on page 67, bottom of. Establishing a communion of feeling and affect, or in short, of opening oneself up to the being of another. And this is above all in dreaming, where the boundaries that surround the self and waking life are dissolved, that this opening up occurs. It's a different way to think about dreaming. Dissolving the boundaries between waking and sleeping life, opening yourself up to a new and higher reality of the world. Think about this for your dreams. This comes to us, by the way, from an ethnographer named Irving Hollowell, who wrote some really super interesting essays about the Ojibwa, which Ingold draws from in various ways, but talking about their beliefs in the ways in which nature was animated. Some classic versions of stuff we'll talk about later as animism. And I hadn't thought much about the Ojibwa. Do we know the Ojibwa? Faintly. Yes, faintly. I was surprised at how faintly they were to me, too. I should know them more. In fact, Silas, you and I should both know them more. In the United States, they are often called the Chippewa. Yes, they're actually one of the largest indigenous groups north of the Rio Grande. They're the second largest in Canada and one of the largest in the United States. And there they are up around the Great Lakes region. They span the US-Canadian border. Trump has just told us it's just a line drawn in the across, it's just a line. And so why don't we just dissolve the line and make Canada the 51st state? And I don't think the Canadians are into this. But I have to say, in Trump's comments that a border is just a line and who drew that line anyway, he's finally admitting that borders are just lines that somebody drew. So why do we even have them? Get rid of them all. Why build walls? They're just lines. Anyway, they span this border, and so they speak both Ojibwa, and so they are also known as the Anishinaabe people. And so they speak French over here, of course, because that's like the French colonized area, and then English over here, probably, but also Ojibwa. They're a pretty large group and they have a lot of subdivisions too. But yes, I was surprised at how only vaguely I knew about them, but they're a pretty large indigenous population, both in the United States and Canada. We'll come back to Hollowell and the Ojibwa from time to time in this course, but I just wanted to put that out there. All right. Now, Ingold then goes into some fairly interesting passages, given these ideas about how people understood the imagination, understood things like dragons and what you were supposed to get out of reading. And eventually we'll get back to indigenous imaginations. He goes into how these monks might have read a book during medieval times. And I just thought it was very interesting how different it often is from the way we read a book. For one thing, you were supposed to read it aloud. You were not supposed to read it quietly. You were supposed to read it aloud. And you were supposed to trace the lines with your finger as you were reading it aloud, because in some ways they saw the book not as something that was meant to be read and understood, but a way in which voices from the book, as you were reading the lines, you would retrace the paths of the authors and meet various people along the way, and so that the book would actually speak to you with voices. For the medieval reader, or pretty late in the game, the whole point was not necessarily to interpret the book, but to come up with there were multiple ways to interpret the book, and one would be reading between the lines as much as reading the lines. Whereas now we're taught to read, and the monks too, they were taught to read in a quite different way. You're just only supposed to read with your eyes in silence, and you're supposed to just read the book by scanning it with your eyes, and you're not supposed to hear voices, and you're not supposed to read out loud, or people will kick you out of the library and make sure you're not able to do that. And we're taught that actually there is one correct interpretation, that you get from reading the evidence and reading the actual lines. And I find myself rather embarrassed as a professor because I'm always having to correct people for not reading and getting the right interpretation out of the book. But in some ways, in the olden days, you might say, that was the whole point, to find different interpretation, make your own interpretations. And so Ingold says that what happens with science and with books is that they cease to be these kinds of conversations that people had. And so nature, like the book, is supposed to be science, and it is only amenable to one interpretation. So then he goes into a long section, which we won't go into, about uniting scientific approaches and religious approaches and anthropology and theology, which is pretty intense. But I wanted to talk about one aspect of it, which was the translation of the Bible, which comes up on page 79. And it's talking about this translator of the Bible, whose name was Robert MacDonald. Robert MacDonald was the archdeacon. He was born in 1829 of a Scottish father and an Ojibwa mother. Actually, that's the other thing about the Ojibwa. They are, unlike other indigenous or Native American groups like the Mohawk, are matrilineal. So the lineages are traced down in your mother's line. But the Ojibwa are patrilineal. So if you were born to a white father and a Ojibwa mother, you would lose your membership because you would not be considered part of the group anymore. So this person was half Ojibwa, but probably lost. Anyway, he got really into the Anglican mission school, and his lifelong ambition was to translate the Bible into what was known as, their language was known as Taduk. And so he finally, in 1898, translated it into the Taduk Bible, which he says was warmly received by these people. But it says this reception was not quite as MacDonald intended. So what happened was MacDonald was very concerned that the Bible be read literally. So he had worked his whole life on this translation. Much to his discomfort, however, many people, including several of MacDonald's own pupils, began to experience dreams and visions in which it seemed the pages of the Bible were talking to them, issuing instructions and revealing prophecies. So here's MacDonald. He'd worked his whole life on a literal translation of the Bible, and he gives it to the people, and they're all excited about it, and he's excited. But then they start claiming that they're seeing these visions and prophecies. These pages spoke with the voices of their elders, the people with whom MacDonald had been working in transcribing the text, and even with the voice of MacDonald himself. Thus, these people, to read the Bible was to open up a conversation with these elders, to listen to their voices, to be taught by them, and to learn. So here they are reading this guy's Bible in a way that he totally didn't mean them to be reading it. And they're thinking they're having this conversation with him and their elders and all the people, and seeing prophecies and having dreams. And that's the way, like, they also got mad at the way the Canadians interpreted the government treaties, because the Canadians saw the treaties as like, okay, this is the way it is, it's set in stone. Whereas for them, it was like, okay, this is the beginning of a conversation that we're having about life and tradition. And it's actually the same way that they see the land. They see the land as teaching them. And so they read the Bible in the same way that they would learn from the land. That was on page 80. To read the land for them is to attend to the multiple clues that reveal the activities and tensions of its human and more than human inhabitants. These clues, wherever they go, Gwich'in are listening, remembering, learning, taking counsel from the land. It is their teacher, not just a repository from which can be extracted materials for the construction of propositional knowledge. Thus, the land speaks to people with many voices, just as the Bible does. And so you have this very interesting and quite different approach of learning from the land and from a book like the Bible, but in the sense not of looking for facts or data or propositional statements or something that you can regurgitate on a test, but from actually listening to the voices and the people and the inhabitants of the land and letting it guide you and teach you. That would be cool. At the end of this chapter, also on page 80, Ingold says that the purpose of this is to heal this rupture, this divide. Now, what are the ruptures that need to be healed? First is between the world and our imagination of it. Heal the rupture between the world and our imagination of it. So, in getting us to consider how the medieval people thought about dragons as the palpable instance of fear, or how the Ojibwa think about dreams, or how the Gwich'in people think about the Bible or the land, is trying to bring together our imagination with the world. Now, you might be asking, well, what were we reading about the reindeer and the baboons for in the last chapter? And it's a similar idea that in the same way we want to heal this rupture or this break that is often said between other human beings, between people and other people, but also between people and our non-human animal companions. And so in some ways, the goal of this is to bring our imagination into reality, to unite, as Silas told us a long time ago, at least in this class, to bring back together the idea of wonder and science. And Ingold ends this chapter with this healing. The rupture of that healing must be a first step towards establishing, towards establishing a more open-ended and sustainable way to live. What do you think? Can we do it? Yeah, that's part of the problem. We're moving in the opposite direction as a nation. We are rupturing all over the place, and we're doing the opposite of healing the rupture. We're tearing into each other like never before. So yeah, on a nationwide level, this isn't happening very time soon. Does it matter if we do this as an individuals though? Then, or should we just give up? Yeah. We're backing up 2 steps here. This is the first step, and then we're gonna backtrack. Probably Ingold was writing this at a time when he thought we could heal this rupture on a more larger scale, but now we're back to me telling you about it. And maybe you can tell some people, but don't put it in an email. There is one nice thing about this in these times is that I don't think anybody's gonna ban me from teaching this. I'm not gonna get thrown out for teaching this. They're not gonna close down my class or rename my class because I told you that we needed to heal the rupture between the world and our imagination of it. I think I'm on pretty safe ground here that no one's gonna understand what the hell I was talking about anyway. So it's like, yeah, we can. So this is gonna be our first step. It's gonna under the radar step. I'm not pulling out any flags and protesting anything. I'm just walking along here, trying to do my thing. Yeah. It's a modest first step, but maybe that's what we have to do first. And maybe in these times, doing that will be a good thing. That's what we can work on during a time when other things are harder to do.